We are officially in the Venum era. Yes, today kicks off the beginning of the Venum sponsorship with the UFC, replacing the Reebok deal, which so many people griped about. And we've got a glimpse into the new pay structure, and it's a little bit more money than before, depending on which bout category you're in, 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 10, that type of thing. You make somewhere between an extra $500 or $1,000. For title challengers and champions, they make an extra $2,000 than they did under the Reebok deal. So initial reactions here, boys, we heard that it was going to be more, money for the fighters. Technically, that is true. What are your thoughts?
So much more money. What an increase. This UFC is so generous. Yeah, it's an increase for sure. But I guess it's something that we should have all expected. Obviously, I didn't expect them to come out the gates with something crazy like, oh, we're doubling your pay. Like, that's never going to happen, especially without collective bargaining from the fighters. So, yeah, the UFC is just going to come up with their own deals for these guys, and they're just going to have to, take it because there's no union. There's no association. They can't go to the table with UFC and say, hey, this is what we want. This is what we're looking to get. The UFC is like, hey, we're bumping your pay up, so you should be happy with this $500 increase that you're getting for your fighter promotional guidelines, whatever they officially call it, promotional guidelines compliance payment. Yeah, I mean, it's good that they're raising the pay, but again, if there was a collective bargaining agreement in place with these guys, I think it could have been a significant bump. But yeah, it's not terrible, I guess. It's similar to what they were getting. And I know that there were questions recently about, how much would sponsors be paying these days anyways. I saw that argument go around recently, but that's another question for another day, I think. But yeah, it's right in line with similar to what the Reebok deal was doing, I guess.
It's about all what we would expect, right? Like it's more. So there's that excuse of you're getting more, but we didn't expect it to be like double, like you were saying, or anything crazy, like a huge deal. Like this isn't a massive groundbreaking thing. And especially during this time where fighter pay is getting to be a hotter and hotter topic as the days go by. And it's just kind of funny, though, the fact that it is an increase, but still very, very similar to the past numbers. As we look at the chart, it's like 2,000 for most of these categories, title challenger champion. And then, 500, I guess those are the 2,000 ones, but that's like the max amount of differences here, just glancing over it. There were a lot of complaints about the Reebok deal in the beginning. Early on, people were not very happy with this. So this is a change, not a very big change, though. It's pretty much, it's a new deal and more money, but it's nothing to write home about, right? And the funny thing about that to me is that just when looking at the brands, Reebok is the bigger brand, right? Like that's not saying anything crazy. So you would have thought that initially that would have started out a lot bigger than it was. And now here with this transition, they're the lesser in this case, not by a lot, right? But they are, when you look at the numbers. So it's just a very interesting thing in that regard when you compare the two. And, we'll see how people react to it. But I don't know. It's practically the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, a slight bump for fighters. Really curious to see more so on how it affects the UFC's end, right? Based on the Reebok deal, you had all of these fees that were required by the UFC to pay, where when it came down to it, when you calculated out what they paid in fighters, what they had to pay in fees, as well as different royalty deals and all of that, we don't know exactly what the UFC made off of the Reebok deal. It may have actually been a loss, though. That's something that, is not being talked about enough, is they may have actually lost some money in terms of that specific deal. What Venum may do is lower their fees and allow the UFC to actually make a little bit profit on the deal. And more importantly, it keeps, intact the entire reason that the UFC went into one of these sponsorship agreements in the first place is their other sponsors. really, once you look at what happened after the Reebok deal, and you hear when Lawrence Epstein, COO of the UFC, said, he got feedback from ESPN and other broadcast partners before they entered the Reebok deal that they didn't really have a professional look. Fighters had, sponsors all over the place representing lots of things. It was a key reason they entered into that sponsorship, is so that they would be able to make more strategic partnerships. And since they've done the Reebok deal, their other general sponsorships from places like Monster, Body Armor, things like that has skyrocketed. So that's really where the UFC is getting the money on this. When it comes to the Venum deal, that will keep that intact, even if the UFC ends up in a break-even status or loses some money like they did with Reebok. But I'd be curious to see if they don't actually make some money, because as Drake just mentioned, Reebok's a bigger company. So you'd think that they would charge more fees. Venum might have been willing to forego some of that just to, get a fraction of the fees that were paid out to Reebok from the UFC. So interesting to say the least. Fighters, again, kind of just left with what they've always been left with, a little bit of a bump. But I mean, do we see fighters, having complaints about this deal as well? Do we see any fighters just kind of shrug their shoulders? I'm not sure. Do you guys think fighters will really have a reaction to this?
I could see them having a reaction just because it's going to be a change from what's been going on. And, naturally, whenever there's a change, somebody's going to complain about something. But yeah, I think they're going to be happier in general because it's not as the Reebok deal was initially released when it was based on rankings. So at least they're still sticking with that same tier of, number of fights, which I guess is better. But yeah, there's going to be something that's going to be a complaint, whether it be about the quality of the new gear or, the more vocal fighters that are actively actually talking about pay and stuff like that will probably come out and say, hey, we should have had a say in the negotiations of this. So I'm sure that there will be some sort of vocalization from some guys and some ladies. It just depends on, how they roll it out. We get the official rollout of what everything looks like pretty soon. So I wonder if they're going to do the same sort of, form the fighters up like Voltron, like they did the first time for the Reebok deal. The funny thing about that, if you go look at that image, I think Conor is the only fighter on that stage that's still with the UFC, which is interesting.
Wow, that would be.
So, yeah.
So I wanted to hone in a little bit on, you mentioned it right there, Matt, the number of bouts kind of scale that they go by and, being maybe better than what they could be. But I've always felt like it might be the best thing, but I want to get your guys' thoughts on if that is the best thing. Because it's weird to me when you think of a case like, let's say, a guy like Michael Chandler, who's very established coming in to the promotion, has built a career, fantastically outside of the UFC. Big name, they come in, but then they're at the bottom of this totem pole. Like, that feels very weird to me, but then I don't know if I have a better solution as for number of fights, but that's why I wanted to hear what you guys think. And Pat, I'm sure you've maybe thought about this too.
Yeah, I mean, the best way I can equate it is that this is the closest they can get to something like a set number of appearances, right? If I enter into a sponsorship agreement as an athlete or a fighter, I'm probably obligated to do so many appearances or wear the brand so many times in order to, actually get money from it. When it comes to the Reebok deal, this structure kind of incentivizes, hey, you have to be under our brand. It doesn't matter how good you are elsewhere. You have to, be under our brand in order to reap the full benefits. And their workaround from that for somebody like Chandler is if you're a title challenger or a champion, you instantly get a bump in pay, right? You can skip the line if you're Chandler, who's fighting for a title now at UFC 262. He's going to get a much higher compliance pay than had he, been fighting a couple of the ranked guys where he'd be making, a couple grand here or there. So I think that's really the equation. Is it's from a marketing perspective of how often are people going to see this, and we're going to pay you accordingly in a set structure. But I'm not sure of a better way that they could do this that incentivizes them as a apparel company on their side. I think that's really what it comes down to is, okay, you've shown the brand 15 times, so you deserve this bump in pay versus, oh yes, you're Michael Chandler, you're a bigger name outside of the UFC, but we're not going to try and for each individual fighter, come to a certain arrangement. I think if they were going to do that, they do things like what Reebok did with Paige Van Zandt and Sage Northcutt of giving them an individual sponsorship deal.
Yeah, I think if they could add in an individual deal on top of that, that'd be great. Because yeah, like, I mean, Chandler essentially came in on a challenger pay, right? Essentially, like if something happened with that main event, he was going to step in and immediately be a title challenger. So there's got to be some sort of way to increase that pay, I would think, in those sort of situations, especially when a guy, whether he gets that fight or not, will still be in the top of the rankings. Versus just getting stuck with that initial pay scale of $4,000, which is kind of terrible. But I don't know. There's a couple of, I'm sure a lot of people out there have other ideas on what can be different with it. But at the end of the day, I just want to see fighters finally come together and start collectively agreeing on what these things should look like instead of the UFC dictating everything.
Would be nice. Would be very nice.
Yep, definitely would be nice. It's a much larger argument that, as we saw with the John Jones, Derek Lewis tweets, a little far off. But let us know in the comments what you think of the new Venum payout structure. Do you think it's fair? Do you disagree with it? Do you believe that, they should have done something differently, whether that's the way that the payout is structured, as Drake mentioned, or just the overall pay in general? Let us know your thoughts and comments. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, the little bell notification. And we'll see what the new fight kits look come April 10th. Hopefully they don't, misspell the names. That would be a good step one.